That's what we're doing when we're praying. We've invited them into our home of the heart. And what you always do when you invite a dear friend in is you rush to the front door and greet them, don't you? That's exactly what we're doing when we pray. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to open our hearts to your transforming presence, that we may feel you within ourselves and see you shining in the eyes of one another. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Amen. Let's meditate together for just a few minutes. Shanti. The topic that we're supposed to be talking about is how to be a messenger of light, which is really one of those wonderful topics because it's just basically how to live a spiritual life. That's all we're talking about. I've written a book. A book has been written. I typed it. About Swami Kriyananda and the making of Ananda. And the title of that book is Light Bearer. In the late 80s, Swamiji, oh, we're going to show the book? Okay. It's not so important, but okay. Here it comes. This wasn't my intention, but here it is. It makes me immensely happy to hold up this book. This was the culmination of my life, really. I jokingly say that if I get stage 4 cancer now, I can just happily go to the astral world, whereas before I would have had to fight to live. But what I was really going to say about, in the late 80s, Swamiji created the Festival of Light after a seclusion he had in Assisi, Italy. And he said he'd been wanting for many years to create a simple ceremony that would embody our teaching. And it was sort of a movement also that just began to, I guess the only word is organize, the sort of force that was Ananda into something that could be more easily taken around the world and translated from our very small family to what it is these days. And in the process of doing that, he'd already designated some of us to give classes, to lead satsangs. But he formalized that all a lot more and came up with the word light bearer, one who carries the light. It was, and now I've grown quite accustomed to the sound of it. At the time, it was a request on his part that we take ourselves and our responsibility to master more seriously than we were taking it. That we not only think in terms of what we can get, but also much more in terms of what we can give. And the other reason he created the Festival of Light, it included, which was pretty much, well, not quite for the first time, but it included the idea that somebody other than Swami Kriyananda could touch you with the spiritual eye and transmit spiritual energy. That was a big step for all of us to see ourselves in that light. And he put us also in formal clothes. We had to wear robes, whereas before we had just picked out anything out of your closet that you thought would match the altar cloth. And you stood up in front of people. Uma, because you're here, I remember this. Uma's from England, and her name at that time, her parents called her Annie, but Uma's the name that Swami gave her, which is better. And we wore white at that time, and unfortunately we didn't have a really fine sense of style, and we also had very little money. So the first white robes were a children's angel costume made out of some fabric that was essentially a sheet. And so it didn't have a real classy look. When Swamiji moved me to Silicon Valley, I just could not put that thing on. And I spent about 4 months trying to figure out how to make it look a little better. But during the angel costume sheet era, Uma's parents came from England and watched her doing, and they took photos of her, and then went home, if I'm correct in this, and they showed the family, when Annie's in her nightgown, that's when she's working. And that's. He said when she's in her nightie. In her nightie. And that's a little how we felt. When I first appeared in front of our congregation, because they were so sophisticated, and I'd been living 16 years in this extremely simple country retreat, and when I first walked out there in a white robe, I was just so uncomfortable. And we'd been giving the services for some time, but in my outfits that matched the altar. And I just remember standing there like this and finally saying to the congregation, "What is different about today?" Because I couldn't handle it. But Swamiji knew what he was doing, of course, profoundly. And one of the reasons he wrote the Festival of Light was because he said many, many people who have a great deal to give spiritually are not necessarily gifted speakers. Having the gift of being able to articulate in a way that is interesting and dynamic to people is just a talent, like cooking or sewing or anything else that you might know how to do. It is not in itself indicative of anything in particular from a spiritual point of view. It's just an ability. And he didn't want our acharyas, our leaders, to be only defined by whether they were clever with words. And he also felt that it was very important, and this is just the Festival of Light, which you hear sometimes, because in Europe and America we have this Sunday morning church tradition. We do the festival every week because it's just part of the way our culture thinks. and it's been dealt with differently here, but that was how we always dealt with it there. And the Festival of Light, essentially in 15 minutes in very poetic language, gives the essence of our path. So Swamiji also thought it was kind of an insurance policy against the fact that not everyone leading the service was so clever with words, that it would always put this force out. But what he also really wanted us to understand is that we are channels. We are bearers of the light, and we can pass that light on. And we don't have to be impressive in any other way except just have that sincere desire to do that. And it was gradually changing. Actually, I'll think of another thing while I'm thinking about Swami in this light. In the early 80s, Swamiji felt that our community was getting a little off balance in certain ways. Our community at that point was one community, which is now Ananda Village. Even the phrase village was not required. You just said Ananda, and you meant that land, and you meant the people that lived there. That was it. That was the beginning, middle, and end of it. And he began to feel that we also had a house in San Francisco. I'm incorrect, because Jyotish and Devi, he'd put Jyotish and Devi in San Francisco for a few years and had them run this big, we had this like 5-story mansion there. We always go into the best neighborhoods. And he had them working there. But Swamiji felt that our thinking about the spiritual path was getting to be a little too much about what can I get. And of course, you see there's a very strong verification for that concept, because after all, this world is but a dream, and I'm here for self-realization. I know when in my early childhood at Ananda Village, in my 20s, I thought I was being loyal to my spiritual ideals by thinking about my self-realization. And I knew Swami was building this community and all of these sorts of things, but I somewhat held myself aloof from that because, this world is just Maya. That's called spiritual immaturity, but that's what I had in spades. And I remember when I began to understand, I was actually in the car with Swamiji. He drove his own car in those days. And we were driving through the land there, which it was about 500 or 600 acres then, and so that's quite a lot. And so you really drive through, looking out the window, seeing places where there had been nothing. I mean, like nothing, just like a field. And there was a little building here and a little bit of something here. And I was feeling very impressed because it takes, as all of you know, it takes a lot of energy to accomplish anything in this world. And I was thinking about how hard Swamiji worked to manifest that community. Because at that point, I was probably working for him as his secretary. And it was more like the words would be personal assistant, is what you would say today. So it included making tea and fixing dinner and, taking care of the house a little bit, just anything that needed to do. And I liked, of course, doing all of that because I was there for self-realization, and I knew that Swami could help me move toward that. And I was in the car, and I was contemplating his friendship, which, if you want to just think of one word for what Swami was and is that he's a friend, in the best and truest and highest sense of that. And I was contemplating what friendship means. And later, not at that time, but later, I read in the New Testament, toward the end of Jesus' life, he's walking with some of his disciples, and he says, "You call me master," and he says, just as honesty, and it's right that you should, He said, "But I call you friend, because a servant," which is what you can think of when you think of master, will help his master, but he never takes his master's world as his own. But a friend stands shoulder to shoulder, and what you need is what I will do for you. And I was contemplating all that Swami has been to me from the very beginning as a friend, just always on my side, no matter how challenging I made that for him, but he was always on my side, on the side of my best interest, I should put it. And then I suddenly realized how hard he was working to build Ananda and how little I was helping him. It wasn't that I wasn't working, because I was. I liked to work. It was fun. But I didn't care. I hadn't taken it into my heart the way he had taken it into his heart. And, he didn't care that I made tea for him. He didn't care whether his clothes were ironed. It was just something that had to be done, but it wasn't why he was living. And I began to understand, which over many years I've understood more and more, why Master says friendship is the purest kind of love, because there's no coercive element to it. I mean, even a mother, which is the most self-sacrificing kind of love, because the baby literally eats up your own body. But there's a coercive element to that. Once the baby is planted and begins to grow in the womb, the mother is committed. And once the child is born, the child will die. But friend to friend is something completely different. And in another place, I believe it's in the Gita commentary, but I'm not sure. I believe Arjuna calls Krishna friend, or Krishna calls Arjuna friend, or maybe both. And there's a lot of commentary in the way that I'm talking about that, because this is the interesting art of being on the spiritual path, is that everything starts in a certain way, and then over time you just see the same things on a deeper and deeper level. That's when I speak of Uma and I growing up together spiritually, we all explored on a deep level and just gradually came to understand what many aspects of that. So it's natural that we think of God as Father or Mother or Master, or, if we think of our masters, we use that word because we do feel so small in comparison. As I was saying before we started formally, I always felt such a child with Swamiji. Not childish, but just so young in development by comparison. On one occasion, I had to buy 3 tickets for a boat ride, 1 for Swami and 2 for me and a friend of mine. We were 30 at that time. The man I'm ordering on the telephone, he says, "How many adults, how many children?" 1 adult, 2 children. And that was just like so self-evident. But if we tried to get on the boat with the half-price ticket, so I honestly felt like I was lying. I had to say 3 adults. So that sense of smallness compared to infinity is quite natural. And it's appropriate because the masters are majestic. But there's another whole side of it where we have to serve God and gurus in the ways that actually help what is important to them. In the Festival of Light, it speaks in this way about the masters. The Festival of Light is about the descent of light in human form. Greater can no love be than this, from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of mankind. Such ever has been the sacrifice of the great masters for the world. I mean, it's really quite... I've been, offering this festival, not every Sunday, but many Sundays for over 30 years now, almost 40 years. Sometimes in the middle of saying those words, I want to sort of stop. Did you hear that? Because it just has so much power. So the masters come for this extraordinary, extraordinary mission is the word I want. And all of us, we're all sitting here because somewhere in this great process, something touched us. And what's so remarkable, if you really think about it, because this is a human, material world, somebody, somewhere, did something that made it possible for us to find out about this, right? Somebody taught a class, somebody published a book, somebody gave you the book, somebody gave you a link, just somebody did something. Somebody somewhere decided to be a messenger of the light. And think about what that means to all of us. Oftentimes, because the number of decades I've been involved on this path is actually quite impressive. Its time is very different than you think. When I was 20, if I had heard the number of 50 years, it would have seemed like a big number to me. Sitting on this side of it, it doesn't seem like anything at all. It's just, I don't know, it's just smoke and mirrors time. It just dissolves into nothing. But because of longevity, people often ask me, how do you stay on the path? How do you stick with it? One of my answers is this: I always remember what it was like before I found this path. And I never romanticize what it would be like, because I remember. And I keep that really vivid. It's the kind of the opposite side. One of Master's pieces of advice for a happy marriage is that you should remember your early courtship days. You should remember the early time of your romance. You should even reminisce about your early romance. And you should keep pictures around of what you were like when you started, right? And so that's because sometimes in the course of life you forget, right? So I do it in reverse. I remember the absolute nightmare of not knowing why I was born or what I was possibly ever going to be able to do. And when I met Swami Vivekananda through a book. Of course, I was too young to meet him in person. That was the first step, which took me to Ramakrishna. And then I believe Ramakrishna took me to Swami. And I was 22 when I met Swami, so I think I suffered intensely for a long time, but in actual retrospect, but still, I remember it. I remember it vividly. But somebody did something. And so here we are with, how do you express gratitude? How do you pay back what's been given to you? We have to serve. We have to serve in the ways that really matter. I mean, in the course of running a community, running an ashram, there's all different levels. And when I say that really matter, what I mean is that we have to pay back in kind. For many years in the community that I have been living in, we would have a Christmas Day service, and at some point we dedicated that service to children, just like in some vain effort to get them to think about something other than what they found under the Christmas tree. And so I gave that service for years, and I would say, this is Jesus' birthday. And you've been invited to a birthday party. And when you come to a birthday party, you bring a present, don't you? And you try to buy a present, bring a present that the birthday person will like. So what kind of a present can we bring to Jesus? And it's especially hard because Jesus isn't really here, so you can't bring him a little car or a paint set or something like that. So what would Jesus really want from you? Well, he would want your heart. He would want your love. He would want your kindness. He would want your commitment to be his agent in this world. So when the masters come, we have these 5 gurus, and we have the ever-living guru of Babaji, who's still somewhere in the Himalayas. When Swamiji was first making his television shows, which had such an impact on India, when he was filming them in Gurgaon, when he very first arrived, somewhere in all of that, some young man came to see him, and the man told a story which Swami later repeated to us, which to me meant that Swami felt it was true. And the man had apparently had an encounter with Babaji somewhere in the forest, and Babaji had spoken to this man about Swami Kriyananda and sent this young man to give Swami Kriyananda a message. And the message was, I believe, if I have this correct, that Babaji had extended Swamiji's life so he could do the work in India, and that he was very pleased with the work that Swamiji was doing. And the message from Babaji was, he was especially pleased about the television shows. Now, my little brain, when I heard that, this is what I actually thought. Does Babaji have a television? And then I thought, in his cave, how could he plug it in, Does he have a generator? Does it run on solar? Just like, and then even like, how does Babaji know about television? But you see how easily the mind can slip into that. We have the picture of out on the wall up here, of the bare-chested yogi. You just don't associate that with the word television, But see how small our minds are? So when the masters come, Paramahansa Yogananda, master, made a strong impression, but not that strong during the course of his life. Think about the life of Jesus, which is the most dramatic. Like, who would have ever thought the influence of that man's lifetime would be what it is? He was crucified on the street between 2 criminals. And most of his disciples were martyred also. And there were only 12 of them at that point, and one of them betrayed him. That's not a story that ends the way it actually ended, because that energy is extremely different than what we think it is. But also you see what happens is because that energy is a living force, and it's a consciousness, it's a ray of grace. The bodies and the faces that we associate with that force, they're literally nothing but windows. Swamiji tried so many times. Every so often he would just come up with a new way of trying to get us to understand what it was we were really in tune with. And we would try, but we would always shrink it back down to something that we could understand. But what really happens with this power is the power is planted, and it radiates. It just radiates continuously, this magnetic force. And it's a magnetic force of love. But love is the most powerful force in the universe. And with love comes joy. This is why we're so attracted to love, because it brings us joy. These are 2 of the 8 manifestations of the divine. And when that comes to us, well, Swamiji answered the question, why did God make creation? Well, the nature of the divine is bliss, and it's the nature of bliss, it's the nature of joy to want to share itself. It's just such a simple thought, isn't it? Think of anything that you really enjoy, and nowadays you take a picture of it, and in real time you send it to all your friends. I'm here enjoying this sunset, I'm here eating this food, I'm here watching this movie. Because it's always better if we give it away, isn't it? And in our little tiny world, we're just imitating God and Guru. And when we really have something to give, which is the life-changing power of divine understanding, it's not that we should do it if we're good disciples, or if we want to be self-realized, I have to do this, I have to do a certain amount of seva. You know, the Catholic Church is really famous for quantifying, just as Swami puts it, just how bad you can be and still get to heaven. As soon as you start quantifying what you have to do to get to heaven, you also have to quantify what the minimum is that you can still get there. And we can do the right thing, motivated by that. But what we really want is to have it just pour out of us because we can't help it. Because it's the nature of joy to want to share itself. I was with Swamiji once when I was visiting in India, and it was right at the beginning, and he used to go over to the Metropolitan Mall and drink coffee in the little shop there, and then Biraj ran for many years. Biraj and Lahari ran the Wishing Tree, which was the little shop they had there. I was with him. I never lived in India, but I would helicopter in periodically and just hang around for a while and then go back. We were after coffee, we would go over to the Om bookstore, and Swami would look at books. He liked books. And we were in the section where autobiography was. And this man came, someone we'd never seen before, and he pulled the book out, autobiography, and he was looking at it. Swami just looked at him and said, "I was his disciple," like that. And Swami said it like he was about 6, you know? I was his disciple. And you could just see that Swami wanted so much for this man to understand the potential of what he was holding in his hand. The man looked a little alarmed and put the book back. So let's not say it was an instant conversion. But I was so struck by the completely spontaneous way in which Swami said that. There was no guile in it, you know. There was nothing. It was just somebody might want what has meant everything to me, and I just want you to have it. So this is what we're looking for when we're talking about being messengers of light, which is we want to find so much happiness and so much satisfaction in our own effort to be in tune with the light that we just can't help ourselves. No, not everyone is like Swamiji. Not everyone is extroverted. You know, some of us just, when I travel, I don't talk to anybody. You know, with what I love most of all is just becoming totally invisible. And I was talking to Dr. Adichie, whom many of you know, and he was talking about how he likes to travel by train in America, because then you can have such interesting conversations with people, he said. And then he proceeded to tell me 3 or 4 of them that he'd had on the trains. I said, Aditya, if I was on the train for 2 weeks, I probably wouldn't make one friend on the whole train. You know, I would just become silent sadhu and just sit and stare out the window the whole time. So it's not as if we have to change our personality. But what we want to really open ourselves to is gratitude and how to pay it back. Just the law of abundance, the beginning law of abundance is gratitude. And also just keeping the flow, keeping the energy moving, understanding deep in our hearts by whatever force motivates you. I had the direct experience of all that Swamiji was giving to me. I wanted to be his friend. But these are the best friends we have, you know? When Master showers us with some uplifted experience, is that supposed to just end with us? And bear in mind, you can radiate that energy without ever speaking a word. When we used to have a program for children in our temple, we had a wonderful gifted man who took that on for a while, and he had it for young children under 12. It was younger children. And he got them all together and he commissioned them to be secret agents for Divine Mother. And during the week between each of their meetings, they were commissioned to do secret service, which meant they had to do kind things for people but not tell anyone. And then they'd all come back together and they would all share the secret service that they'd done. But he did it for children, but it's true for us, isn't it? If you're in a position where you can be open about what's moving you, of course you should do that. But don't think you need to be in a position to be open. Because do we act just as my egoic self doing what I want? Or do we act as an instrument of a higher reality and be a friend to those masters who have sacrificed to help us to carry it on? Again, when I was here earlier, I was talking about how much bigger this work has become just in the 10 years since Swami died. How did that happen? It happened because of all of you and all the other people. Somebody somewhere did something that woke you up. And if that waking up is at all meaningful to you, then it demands, by its own nature, it demands that you turn to the one next to you or the one behind you or the one in front of you and just offer it in. Meditate on how to make this your spontaneous reaction to life. You know, not a should, not a I'm supposed to, but why would I not want to? Okay? So, do we have any thoughts or questions or anything that we could direct? It doesn't have to be directly related. Oh, you know, I never finished. I started the book not merely to plug the book, so let me just tell you for fun. I tend to be very private about my creative work. I have a preference for, you're going to fill my cup again, which is very nice. I have a preference for my own creative ideas, and I prefer to present a finished product to people than to get a lot of others involved. Swami once called me a corporation of one. But when it came time to name this book, the book was entirely finished. I just could not think of what we should call it. And I sent the manuscript, and I sent notices out to about 20 people, all these different ideas that were there, and people suggested all kinds of different things. And just, and then they were arguing with each other about which was the best, you know, and I just observed the whole thing and thought it was really odd. I mean, odd, meaning that I had opened myself to this kind of group conversation. And then just oftentimes I get, well, I'll put it more directly. I think so, sometimes I hear what Swami wants me to do as I wake up in the morning, because I put my conscious mind to sleep. You know, that's why a lot of inspiration comes in dreams or just at a waking point, because you put your conscious mind to sleep, and reason is not fighting with inspiration. So answers will come. So Light Bearer was somewhere on the list. It had been mentioned, but it didn't get any traction. Nobody liked it. I just woke up one morning and it was just like, this book is to be called Light Bearer. That was that. I wrote all the 20 people and said, and then, you know, some of them objected, but I said, too bad, it's not a, you know, it's not a conversation anymore. Decision was made. I said, all your objections are perfectly valid, but apparently they're not going to carry the day. You know, this has just been done. But I've been so happy with that, because it's just, if you, and I wrote right in the first page, you know, a light bearer is someone who influences the consciousness of others merely by his own consciousness, with nothing else. But I said it more gracefully than that, I can't remember. But that's what we're really talking about. If we emanate light, everything around us changes. This is not really about me, but this is just sort of fun. I flew into Chennai to visit the monastery and all that there. Chandigarh, you're right, thank you. And I had to check my, they confiscated my carry-on because it was humongous. They were correct. And then I was the last one. It just took a really long time, and 3 of the monks were standing outside, Devarshi and Shankar, and they were out there. And this European man came out, and he sort of looked at them and said, "Why are you all dressed in blue?" And then he said something about some woman on the plane who'd been dressed in blue. But this is what he said. She had a lot of light in her eyes. Yeah, I mean, I don't say that because it's about me. We should all have that light in our eyes. That's what I'm really trying to say. We should all be walking around just filled with the light. We should be bearing the light at all times. It shouldn't be like we stand out. We should be just like one of a crowd of people whose eyes are filled with light because our hearts are filled with light. It's not something you can fake. It has to just come right out of you. So I've really been pleased because that's what Swami did. He just walked around and carried the light everywhere he went. And they asked Mother Teresa of Calcutta once, this very cynical journalist said, "Mother, they say that you're a saint. What do you think about that?" I don't know what I expected her to say. "Oh no, not me." She said, "And why aren't you a saint?" That was her answer. What else are you doing here? That's how we should feel about this. What else am I doing here? I have a real job. Let me carry it out. Okay, I asked for questions and then just made up more of my own. So. Anything you'd like me to talk about? I didn't plant any shills, so I should have.
It's the first question that takes the...
What was it like to see the monastery up in Shankar? What were your impressions?
It reminded me of my spiritual childhood is what it did, meaning, and that's what I kept saying to them, oh, this is so much fun. There's absolutely nothing here. This is going to take so much work. It's just going to be, you have endless setbacks, you know, and it's just going to be so much fun. Really, I just loved it. Shivani, who lives in Assisi, she was a pioneer. She was one of literally the first group of people with Sadhana Devi and Jaya and Jyotish, the first group to winter over. And she said, I hope by the time we're putting sidewalks into this place, I'm off somewhere plowing up the desert again. Because that's the certain phase that's just so much fun. So that's how I felt about it. You know, they're a fun group too. They'll make it. Hello, my friend.
So, yeah, I forgot the name. I'm nervous now. So, my question is, I missed the whole talk.
Oh, good.
But I was listening online.
Uh-huh.
Can you share some tools if someone wants to become a channel of light but cannot do it all the time, or most of the time, or none of the time? What is the tool one should remember to keep practicing so that something happens?
We are made of light. The only lasting eternal reality is light. Everything that you think is you that isn't light isn't really you. So to begin with, it's inherent in all of us. So what really opens us is very simply the desire to be a channel of light, meaning the desire to help others. I know a lot of us were drawn to the path just because of compassion. Just that you just want to do something that's really meaningful in this world. My frustration, which I remember very vividly, was I had a tremendous desire to help people, and I couldn't think of anything that I believed in enough that could really help them. You know, I played around with politics. I was part of the time when the Vietnam War was happening and people were protesting. Much to my parents' horror, I was at Stanford University for 1 year before I gave up on higher education. And we occupied the administration building. I have no idea why. And we actually spent the night there, spent a couple of nights there, and I come out carrying a pillow, looking totally disheveled. photographer gets my picture and I'm right on the front page of the Stanford Daily. Here's my parents, and I just come out like this. But it was, everything I tried was so fraught with contradictory energies that I was just desperate. Would I never find anything I could really give my heart to? And so when you find something that you really can believe in every circumstance, we can have, and these are the two simple prayers. This is the tool you're asking for. There's two prayers. How can I serve? How can I love more? And there's no circumstance in your life when that's not applicable, is it? How can I serve? How can I love more? You can be taking care of plants. You can be taking care of animals. You can be cleaning a house. You can be the president of a country. How can I serve? And how can I love more? And don't think, and this is the most important thing, don't think that your gestures have to be huge and dramatic. Because the change doesn't come by huge dramatic gestures. Change comes a minute at a time when we just are a little bigger than we were the minute before, or a little bigger than we're inclined to be in this moment. But instead of thinking, what do I want? We think, how can I serve? Yeah, that's all there is to it. We think because this world is complex that the spiritual path is complex. But it isn't. It's really a very simple matter of the heart. So just, if you're in doubt, just ask those questions. Pray those questions. And something will occur to you. You'll see it right in front of you. Yes?
Umaji mentioned last Sunday's session how everything is important in the spiritual world, like there's no one thing which is more important than the other. Given that, what is the one thing for you which was importanter than the rest?
A quality or an attitude that was what was being discussed on Sunday.
Somebody once asked me, of the 8 manifestations of God, which ones were my favorite? Which was a question I'd never considered before, but when I considered it, I realized of the 8, I really like wisdom, meaning I have really loved learning these teachings. And I love thinking about them and thinking how they apply to every situation I'm in. And for me, working hard to have a very clear understanding of the teachings has been very, very meaningful to me. And then having the courage to not shrink from the implications of the teachings. Here's an example that I went through. There was a crisis among people that I was involved with, and it involved a hospital, as crises sometimes do, and I had to be pretty together to help the rest of the crowd, but it just was too much for me. So I went out to my car in the hospital parking lot, which I'm sure that parking lot has witnessed a lot of tears, and I was really just beyond myself, weeping about the fact that people were suffering and we didn't seem to be able to do anything about it. And in the middle of it, a voice came in my right ear, rattled through my brain and came out my left ear. That's the way it felt to me. And the voice said, "Do you think this is happening outside the will of God?" And it was like I couldn't keep crying. And I remember just thinking even at the time, sort of like, oh, phooey. But I also thought, well, this is the fruit of having tried so hard to really understand what the spiritual path is. And I had to stop crying, but I was still pretty upset. So I said to God, Divine Mother, whoever had spoken to me, I don't know who it was, I said, well, you better do something about this. If this is your project, I think you need to work on it a little better than you are. And then I just was perfectly honest, because I don't think I can carry on much longer. You're going to lose me as a team member here unless you do something. And I went back into the hospital, and the tide had turned, and everything went positive from that point. But that to me was a powerful example of all the, just when it wasn't a crisis, just always trying to guide my life by what I really knew was true. And that doesn't mean by any means that I always could. But I've tried to avoid, I won't say that, I've always tried to avoid. The teachings are very, very high. You know, it's like it's Mount Everest here. So it's kind of tempting to just bring it down a little so that we'll feel a little closer to the top of the mountain. But to have the nerve to know where it is and the humility to know where I am, and just work to try to close that gap with honesty, with intellectual honesty, is what I would say. So, and the other wisdom character the other of the 8 is I like joy. Wisdom gives me joy. Okay, good question. Any others? Yes.
When we say that the divine talks to us in different ways, like you just mentioned, somebody spoke something to me.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it also comes through different people or some random source. So how do we be attuned to know that it is actually the divine that is talking to us, or is it something that's not useful for us?
How do we know it's the divine or something else? There's a joke, which is, you need good judgment to live well. How do you get good judgment? From bad judgment. So it's also true. I mean, the number of times that anything as dramatic as a voice going through my brain like that have happened, well, let's see, how many times has it happened? Once. So we have these false ideas. We have these false ideas that God speaks to us always dramatically from the burning bush. And I've had this with people sometimes. They're convinced that they can get inspiration for themselves, but they're absolutely certain that nobody can get inspiration for them but them. And it's the hardest thing in the world is to get clarity for yourself, because you have so many cross currents of desire in it. So you're absolutely correct. Very often God speaks perfectly clearly to you from people around you. I think it's receptivity, it's humility, and it is also, I'm just going to go back to, having a clear idea of what the path really is, so that you can recognize ideas that are consistent with what we're really trying to accomplish. The most important thing, though, is just a deep sincerity, a deep, sincere desire to live by the truth. And cultivate the sincerity of that desire more than you cultivate all the other desires. So even when I had to admit that what was happening was by the will of God, I also was willing to say to whoever spoke to me, you better do something. Because, of course, I want to just accept it, but I also needed to be sincere. And I couldn't say, oh, well, that's fine. Well, then I just won't care if all these people are suffering now, because it's your will. That was completely insincere. Sincere was, this is awful, and I'm really at the end of my rope here. So even if it was God's will, we're going to have to work on it. Like that. Is that fair? I will tell you just an interesting story. My mother died about 20 years ago, and she had Parkinson's for 15 years. And we all knew that someday, at least what we read, was that Parkinson's would go to her brain and she would start having brain seizures. Until then, she could be mentally normal, but that was often how it ended. So my mother started having a seizure. She had one seizure. I lived some distance from her, but I often saw her. She had brain seizure. She had to go to the hospital. It was pretty ghastly. I went to visit her again, and she had a seizure while I was there, or I went to the hospital with her. We're in this big emergency room, and she's a small woman, and she was even smaller, kind of curled up on the bed, recovering from this seizure. And I called all the masters into the room. And it was kind of a big room, I don't know why, but I just sat them like this, and I said, I've done a lot for you and I need a favor. And I just pointed to my mother. I said, this is not an option. We're not going to do this. And about 2 weeks later, she died, which was good. You know, it was just like, yes, it was God's will. I could say all kinds of things, but I just reached my limit. I was very sincere about wanting to do what God wanted, but I also wanted them to know where I stood. And actually, I was traveled to Italy, and I happened to be with Swami, and my sister called me, and she just said like this, Mom died this morning. And I said, my response, good for her, because she, you know, the body had become uninhabitable. And so she just walked out of it. Good for you, Mom. That was courage, that was wisdom. Just like that. That's sincerity, is what I'm trying to say. Be yourself. Cultivate sincerity with the masters. Here's a tip. They read your heart. They're not fooled anyway. But if you don't tell them the truth, it's harder to work with you. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts or questions?
Do you have a last fond memory with Swamiji? I mean, I could ask you questions, but it'll go long. So, do you have a fond memory of Swamiji that you
Well, all the memories are fond.
I love this.
I saw him the last time on the Watunda, is that what you call it? Watunde land. That was the last time I saw him, around Master's Mahasamadhi Day. I was there visiting, and he actually essentially gave me the rest of my life instructions at that point, what he hadn't told me before. It was all about projects like this. I mean, it literally was like, you know, write about him. He told me to write the story of Ananda, which I thought was an odd thing for him to ask of me in this sense, because I was never, in an odd way, I was never really part of that founding community, because I always worked for Swami or I worked with the guests. Jyotish and Devi, by contrast, and Jaya and Sadhana were all right in the middle of the community, making the community, but I was either at the meditation retreat or at the monastery. So it was just an odd thing, which I'll tell you in just a moment. He told me to write a spiritual novel, and I was finishing the book Ask Asha, and then he told me to make a movie about John Parsons' book, which was about the 12 years of litigation that we had. And he went like this, you know. So he was sitting in that big room where he would sit, and he was sitting in his chair. I think we were alone. And he just told me like this. Later, I was supposed to go to Romania with him in June, but he died in April. You all went on to Romania, but I didn't come from the U.S. So instead of going to Romania, I went into seclusion. And I was staying in the dome that he had at the seclusion retreat that he lived in at the beginning. I was walking down the fire road thinking, the story of Ananda, you know, I just couldn't think of it. Then I realized he was telling me how to write the book about him. You know, it was just like, I didn't know that. And okay, this is how Swami said he guided us. I'll give you just a little background here. There's a book somewhere that Nishala Cryer wrote, and she interviewed a lot of founding members or key members of Ananda and then wrote up the stories. She did a very good job. Wherever that book is, it's worth reading. And both Nitai and Devi made kind of humorous remarks about Swamiji giving them a giant assignment and then kind of leaving them. Okay, Swami read the book. He really liked the book. He called Devi and he called Nitai. He said, I never left you alone. He said, in my consciousness, I was always with you. And he made them reprint the book. because he just didn't want that. This is how I remember it. You know, when I'm telling someone else a story, I have to always stop and say, I hope this is correct. But it was like that. He said, I never left you alone. And then this is what he said. The way he guided us was that he would project thoughts to us. And then he talked, let me go back. He said, this is how Master guided them. He said, Master assigned him to organize the monastery at Mount Washington when he was a young monk. He said, you would have thought Master would have told me how to do it. He said, Master told him almost nothing about how to do it, just a few things here and there. And Swami said, if Master had given me even one specific instruction, I would have done everything I could to follow it. But he said he realized what Master did was project energy to him that awakened his intuition. And then the ideas that he followed came out of him rather than being imposed on him. So then when Swamiji was talking about how he worked with us, which I really had experienced, but I hadn't understood it till he articulated it, he would project energy and ideas to us, and the ones that resonated with us, whoever, you would take it into yourself, and then it would be activated by your attunement with it. And then it would grow out of your own energy. So in this case, he suggested, he didn't suggest, he told me to write the story of Ananda, which, as I said, it just seemed odd to me. Because I was supposed to write about him, and I didn't feel like it was my job. But then I was just walking, and I said, oh, of course, he was telling me how to write about him. So I wrote this as a year-by-year chronology of how Swami made Ananda happen, because that, from my perspective, was the story of Ananda, was how he did it. So that was a very fond memory. Okay. Well, we might have used up our allotted time, and if there's one more, I'll take it, and if not, we'll call it a night.
There is one online question.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Why do we crave to be understood and loved by people?
The question is, why do we crave to be understood and loved by people? Well, God knows we all do. I mean, on a epic scale that can't be denied, everybody craves to be loved and understood by people. And so it doesn't serve us to pretend that we don't. Because we recognize how bereft we are, how bereft we feel, and we think that other people can fill that feeling of lack. And by learning about love and compassion and kindness and friendship in a tangible way, like we can from one another, then we can gain through actual experience, slowly by slowly, an understanding of what will fulfill us. So we just have to start with the obvious. Now, bear in mind, Master said, human love, perfectly expressed, a little bit of a condition there, but human love, perfectly expressed, is almost the same as divine love. So Master was never dismissive of human love. In fact, he often wrote about it in a very exalted way, because it's magnificent, because it's each of us rising to our own highest potential when we have the capacity to love and understand each other. We are moving closer and closer to who we really are when we're able to do it. So one of the reasons I think why we crave it so much is because it's the best teacher in the world. And this is a school. This is a school for us to learn what really causes suffering and what really brings us true happiness. And our extraordinary, compelling need for each other pushes us to lesson after lesson after lesson until we graduate. And here's another part that's extremely important in this. So there's several things. Wait just a second, the thought's slipping away. That's so odd. It's right there. I know what it is. Give me a moment. Oh, I know what it is now. We tend to think that the way we overcome desires is by disciplining them and repudiating them, which is, good work if you can get it, but it doesn't usually always work. So Swami put it this way. We learn something from having our desires thwarted, but we learn much more from having our desires fulfilled. Because if your desires are disappointed, some part of you always imagines, I would be happier if I had it. And what that means is that you're holding some piece over here that you can't give to God because I still want this. But if our desires are fulfilled, which is why we get back in the game again and again and again, because when our desires are fulfilled, we realize, oh, this was wonderful. Wonderful lifetime of love and affection or whatever. This is wonderful, but it's still not enough. And then we're able to move on from it, and in one way or another, because we know exactly how much happiness it can bring us, which is almost enough. But then we have to add on top of it divine realization, because our hearts are restless. We were made for thee alone, and our hearts are restless till we find our rest in thee. So we should love each other with every ounce of energy we have. We should try to understand and recognize and give to each other. How can I love? How can I serve? Because that's how we find out what we really want. And so God set the world up. That's how the game is played. Someone said, not I, but it's brilliant. Life is the only game in which the goal of the game is to learn the rules. Okay? I think that will serve us for this evening. Thank you all very much. I'm very happy to be here. It's just great fun to see all that you have done here. What fun. Okay.
There are books at the back for anybody who would like to pick up one of Asha's book. Not just the Light Bearer, I think there are 4 in total, is that right? So people are welcome to look at them, and if they would like that book signed by Asha, now is the time, or any time during the next couple of